Hello again, class. All right, today will be our fourth and last lecture on the Revolutionary War. And when we ended our last lecture, we had just talked about Valley Forge, how Washington lost about a fourth of his army, but those who survived through Baron von Steuben's training were a much better trained, better prepared army. Add that in with the addition of the French forces, and America was in a much better position in early 1778 to fight against the British. However, the war was still going to last for another 3 years. And as I mentioned before, we're not going to go battle by battle through this war. There are certainly resources online if you're interested in that. We just simply don't have time. For instance, in the late 1700s, in the late 1770s, early 1780s, there were a lot of battles back and forth in the Carolinas, particularly South Carolina, fighting over the port of Charleston, real back and forth engagement there. We're not going to go into those in depth, but the information is certainly out there if you'd like it. I do want to touch briefly about the war at sea, however. If you remember from my prior lectures, I've referenced many times that Britain had the world's most powerful navy, and they controlled the trade routes. Right? So you're thinking, why is that important? We're talking about a war in the 13 colonies, or the 13 states as they're now called after the Declaration of Independence. What do we care about international shipping routes? Well, a couple reasons. One, because remember, a lot of America makes their economies based on trade, international trade. Certainly the South is based on cash crops that they sell mostly in Europe. Also, if France and Spain and other European countries are going to help out the Americans by sending them supplies, how are those supplies going to get to America? Well, they're going to get there overseas. So if Britain controls and shuts down these trade routes, it not only hurts the American economy, which in turn hurts America's efforts to fund the war, but it also hurts the efforts to receive aid from Europe. All right, so the fact that British controlled these trade routes is a big problem for the Americans. And America, who didn't even have a navy in 1774, knew it couldn't defeat the British Navy. There's just no way. So the Continental Congress permitted what are called privateers to attack British merchant, those are trade ships. All right, so civilian ships that are doing trade between Europe and the Americas. All right, we don't have a navy. America doesn't have a navy that can just fight battle after battle against the British Navy. So what America does instead is it permits these privateers to hurt British economy. Right? You attack their merchants' ships, you take their merchants' goods. America can then take them for their own economic activity at the same time while hurting British merchants. Okay? All right, so I've used that word privateer a couple times. What is a privateer? A privateer is a private ship that is allowed to attack an enemy's merchant ships. All right, so a privateer is not an official member of the U.S. Navy. It's not a military ship. Okay, that's why we call it a privateer. It's a private ship. It's just a ship typically taking goods back and forth to Europe. Okay, but Congress said, look, I'll tell you what, privateers, if you want to go attack British merchant ships and take all their goods on board, you can. We'll let you keep a portion, we'll get a portion, and everybody will be happy. Not the British merchants, of course, but everybody will be happy. All right, so what does this sound like? What type of group of person is this who attacks ships at seas? The word sounds kind of like privateer. All right, the word I'm thinking of sounds like privateer, except it starts with a PI like pizza. All right, PI. What's that word? And it sounds like privateer, starts with PI. There's also a famous sports team in Pittsburgh named after this group of people. Excuse me. It's not the Pittsburgh Penguins. That's a hockey team. It's the baseball team, the Pittsburgh Pirates. All right, think of the word pirates. Essentially, what the Continental Congress did was allow Americans to act like pirates on the Atlantic Ocean, or at least as to British ships. And the reason for this was to cause economic harm to Britain. And so, as you would expect, British merchants did not like this policy. All right, and so many of them started to hope the war would end. Wars, you have to understand, yes, a lot of times the winning side of the war is the one who took the most land or captured the most land or inflicted the most damage on the other person's or other country's land or killed the most soldiers, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's often how you know who won and who lost the war. But a lot of times, economics and politics come in play. A lot of times, the, quote, winning side of the war is simply the side who doesn't quit. It's simply the side who's willing to keep fighting. And once you inflict enough harm on your adversary, on your opponent, their will to fight starts to go down. So the Americans can't inflict harm on the British Navy, or at least not very much of it. But they can hurt British merchants. And so people in Britain will start thinking, you know what? The cost of this war is worth more than whatever benefit we're going to get out of it. Okay, and so don't underestimate the importance of inflicting economic damage on your opponent or adversary during a war. All right, let's talk about John Paul Jones. He was the leader for America's most famous victory at sea. He's one of the people, at least, who sometimes is called the father of America's Navy. There are a couple other people who sometimes convey for that title. But John Paul Jones was a Navy captain. All right, so I guess in that respect, you could argue he's sort of like the first captain in America. All right, he's a captain on some important Navy ships. And in 1779, he sells some ships all the way over to the British Isles, and he attacks 2 warships that were guarding a number of supply ships along the English coast. Again, Britain is still trying to engage in trade throughout the war. They're having to provide the Redcoats supplies throughout the war. So this is another challenge the Redcoats have. They're fighting on a continent that is an ocean away from their home. So Britain is faced with the challenge of keeping an army an entire ocean away, supplied with the materials they need to fight the war. So a lot of those supplies come from Britain. Supply ships aren't typically very well armed. So a lot of times, the Navy will provide warships to protect the supply ships that are taking supplies to the Army on the other side of the ocean. So if you can get rid of those warships, then you're able to attack the supply ships. And that's what John Paul Jones, who and I'm probably the only person to ever refer to him as Captain America, but who I just referred to as Captain America. John Paul Jones attacks these ships. In a very famous battle off the British coast, or the English coast, ensues. The ships ram each other. At one point, they get locked together. The cannon fight and the gunfight lasts for 3.5 hours. And at one point, the British captain demanded that Jones surrender, and Jones yelled what's now become a very famous line, "I have not yet begun to fight." And so eventually, our hero, John Paul Jones, wins the battle. And this angers the British, but conversely, it also inspires the Americans. Remember some of the other lessons we've talked about, going back to Lexington Concord, Bunker Hill, Washington crossing the Delaware River into Trenton. A lot of these battles, yes, they're important militarily, Saratoga being the most famous example. They're important militarily, but they're also important for other reasons, political reasons or morale reasons, to give your side hope. To convince others, like Saratoga did, to convince other countries that your side has hope. So when you're thinking about this war, think about the importance the battles have, not just from a military standpoint, but from a more overall standpoint. How is it helping the country win future battles? All right, and inspiring Americans, giving them hope, giving them a reason to join the cause, is a very important reason. or is a very important result of a lot of these battles we're talking about. Because remember what we just talked about, a lot of times the winning side is simply the side that refuses to quit. All right, so if the other side loses hope before your side does, then your side can often win the war. And that's what these battles for America did. It kept providing America enough hope that they would continue the war long enough until Britain surrendered. Okay. And when does that happen? We're going to fast forward now to 1781. The Battle of Yorktown, I'll go ahead and issue a spoiler here. It's the last battle of the war. All right, so by 1781, people back in Britain had begun to grow tired of this long, expensive war. It had broken out in 1775, all right, a full 6 years, about 6.5 really. Britain and the American states had been fighting. And, a lot of people in Britain just wanted to go back to the way things were. They had this great trading partner over on the other side of the Atlantic that, both sides were making money from the mutual trade. And so a lot of people in Britain are thinking, why can't we just go back to the way things were? We can go back to making money with the colonies through trade rather than losing money by constantly having to fund and pay for a war. All right. So by 1781, a lot of the fighting had moved into the Virginia area. And the British General Cornwallis makes kind of a blunder here. He sets up his base at Yorktown. Now, as you can see from the map, Yorktown is on a peninsula, a body of land surrounded by water on 3 sides. Okay? This turns out to be a mistake, as you can see from the arrows in that map, because it allows Cornwallis to essentially be bottled up. All right, so Cornwallis sets up his base at Yorktown. I believe his thinking was he wanted somewhere pretty much in the middle of the country so he could move north if he needed to or south if he needed to. He wanted to be somewhere in the middle along the coast. But the problem is he picks a spot, this peninsula, inside the Chesapeake Bay. All right, that's that body of water that goes up kind of along the Virginia and Maryland coast there, and creates that kind of that, body of water inside the land somewhat. All right. And this allows him to be bottled up because, as you can see, there's a fairly narrow opening into the Chesapeake Bay. That's where some of those arrows, talking about de Barras and de Graces, French fleet going into, where those wide arrows are pointing. This is the opening of the Chesapeake Bay. So once Cornwallis sets up his camp, a French fleet from the West Indies, what we now call the Caribbean, they sail up from the West Indies and they block the Chesapeake Bay. And so this blockade kept Cornwallis from receiving supplies or escaping. All right, so now, Britain can't get new supplies to him. It can't get reinforcements to him because the French fleet has blocked up the Chesapeake Bay. And Cornwallis can't escape it, at least not by water. I guess at some point he had a chance to escape by land, but that was taken away from him also. Because Washington, along with a large French force led by a man named General Jean Rochambeau, headed south. Okay. And so around the same time, the Marquis de Lafayette arrives with thousands of soldiers from the west. All right, and so now you have these forces led by Washington, Rochambeau, with Lafayette's division, all march in from the north and the west and bottle up Cornwallis over land. So now Cornwallis can't escape over land, and he can't escape over sea. Okay? And a lot of this was helped because there was an American slave named James Armistead, and he was working as a spy for Lafayette. And so he was able to give valuable information about the British that helped the American army. So one way the Americans knew where Cornwallis was and what he was doing was because of this slave who was acting as a spy for the American cause. Okay, and I'll go ahead and jump ahead in the story. About 7 years after this battle, James Armistead is eventually given his freedom, but not before Lafayette has to write to Congress. Lafayette's back in France by 1787. And he writes to Congress, say, excuse me, I just learned that James Armistead is still a slave. What are y'all doing? Why haven't you set him free? He was the one, who made these huge contributions that gave America its freedom, that won the battle at Yorktown. Why in the world are you still keeping him as a slave? So eventually, people in Congress were able to secure Armistead's freedom, but not before he had to live life as a slave for another 6 or 7 years, even after he provided us valuable information that helped America win its freedom. All right, and so I've basically told you that I've already given you a spoiler. I've told you what happens here. America wins this battle. The combined American and French forces trap Cornwallis on this peninsula. He can't go backwards over land. He can't go forward over sea. So, Washington and the American French forces start a siege. Okay, a siege is when an army surrounds a town or a fort and simply waits for the enemy to give up. You can surround them, not allow any food to get in. You start starving them out. Perhaps if you have enough artillery, you can bombard them with cannon fire, that sort of thing. So Washington sets up a siege in September of 1781. And as I mentioned, they simply pound Yorktown with cannons day and night for several days. So eventually on October 19, 1781, coincidentally, almost 4 days almost exactly 4 years after Saratoga ended, the Battle of Yorktown comes to a conclusion also. And General Cornwallis surrenders, again, October 17, 1781. So the end of October, or mid-October of 81, 6.5 years after the first battles of Lexington and Concord, the Americans are victorious. 8,000 British soldiers laid down their arms. When the British Prime Minister heard about the defeat, he exclaimed, "It is all over." Oddly enough, Washington thought that it was going to take one more decisive battle. Washington basically kept his troops on alert for quite a while after this, thinking, well, I don't know if we've defeated the British just quite yet. We may have to defeat them in one more battle. But what he didn't know is over across the Atlantic Ocean, the British Prime Minister already realized that Britain was done fighting. All right, so Britain has lost a war that I promise you 6 or 7 years earlier, they had never conceived of the possibility of losing. So the Americans had won the war. All right, so how? How is this possible? How did a nation without a national army, without any navy to speak of whatsoever, defeat one of the strongest military powers on earth? One, better leadership. All right, remember back to our lesson on Saratoga. The British were defeated at Saratoga in large part because they had a plan, and Burgoyne was the only one who followed through with the plan. Remember, they were supposed to have 3 separate generals approach, the British, that is, were supposed to have 3 separate generals approach the Hudson River Valley from different areas, but only one showed up, which allowed him to be defeated. Look at Cornwallis in Yorktown. He camps out on a peninsula and allows himself to be surrounded. All right, so Britain leaders made some pretty big blunders. All right. Conversely, Washington, and some people will sometimes criticize Washington's in-battle tactics, and he wasn't, a professional soldier. He'd fought during the French and Indian War, sure, but then he'd gone back to being basically a tobacco farmer until the Revolutionary War. All right, so he probably made some military tactics, but he understood how this war was going to be won, which was to keep his army alive long enough, keep Britain from having to chase him all over the country, wear them down until they're ready to quit. He understood that, and Britain didn't seem to understand that as well. All right, to foreign aid. You can't get around the fact that America was immensely helped in its battle against Britain by France and other European powers. Without French and Spanish aid. The Netherlands loaned some money. Without this foreign aid, it's very difficult to conceive of how Americans could have won this war, certainly by 1781. So don't ever underestimate the benefit of that aid coming mostly from France. They knew the land. All right, the Americans lived here, so they knew the land better than these British generals and officers who were coming from Britain, and may never have spent time in America or the places they were fighting until the actual time of the battles. So it's always an advantage for sort of the home team, so to speak, the team fighting or the army fighting on their own land. The size of the land and distance from Britain. Remember, Britain's a very small country, and they're trying to conquer a very vast territory. And as we talked about at the first of this lesson, Britain is having to get their supplies from an ocean away. And those supplies are having to go all up and down, the American coast, which is a very large coastline along the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so this was a logistical challenge for Britain. And finally, motivation. All right, the Americans were fighting for their freedom. All right, people like George Washington, he could have been hanged for treason if he had lost the war. All right, so he's literally fighting this to stay alive. The Americans are fighting for their own home, for their motivation. The British, however, are fighting basically for mercantilism. Remember, they want a colony so that they can control the traded economy to make the mother country, i.e. Britain, rich. That's what mercantilism is. So they're fighting for an economic benefit. But after 6.5 years of war, it's costing them way, way more than they're going to make through some mercantilism economic theory. All right. So the cost of the war just becomes so large that it doesn't make economic sense. They fought this war to keep this colony so they could make money from the American colonies. And instead, they've just been losing money year after year after year. Whereas if you go back to peace, establish somewhat of a trading partnership with America, then you can go back to making money. Now, granted, you're not going to make as much money as if you controlled the colony, but you can at least go back to making some money instead of losing money. All right, so quite frankly, the Americans were just much, much, much more motivated to win this war than the British were. Now, it took a couple years for the terms of the treaty to be hammered out. Fighting stopped in 1781. The sides don't reach a treaty until 1783. And this was done in Paris. Okay? So you must know the name of this treaty. The Treaty of Paris of 1783. All right. We say of 1783 so as not to confuse it with the Treaty of Paris that had also ended the French and Indian War. I want you to know both of those treaties, but if you're going to know one, you have to know this one. The Treaty of Paris of 1783. And on the American side, it was negotiated by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. All right, so this is a very famous painting, famous for the fact that it's not complete, because Franklin, Adams, and Jay were negotiating with some British diplomats, and they all went to Paris to negotiate the terms of this treaty, and they were going to sit down for a painting. So a painter showed up. He painted the American side, but when it was time to paint the British diplomats, they refused to attend the meeting. They didn't want to become famous as the people who lost the American colony, so they refused to be painted. So that's why this painting is incomplete. All right, so what are the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1783? One, most importantly, U.S. was independent. That's obviously by far the most important term, and it's the one that was absolutely necessary. That was what the whole fight, at least after July 4th, 1776, that's what this whole war had been about. So if America doesn't gain its independence, then what had it been fighting for? All right, so that's first and foremost. Britain finally said, yes, you are free. You're not our country anymore. You're your own country. Go off and be independent. But then they had to set the borders. So the borders became Canada in the north. Okay, so America didn't get Canada. That stayed part of Britain. but then they set the border as the Mississippi River. Remember, this whole course we've been talking about how the border of the 13 colonies was the Appalachian Mountains. And even after the French and Indian War, when Britain had taken away the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River from France. And once upon a time, that was French land. But after the French and Indian War, France loses it to Britain. All right, that was the Treaty of Paris of 1763. It gave that land to Britain. Well, now 20 years later, that exact same land is turned over from Britain to the American colonies. All right, so once upon a time in the Proclamation of 1763, Britain had told the colonies, hey, you stay out of that Ohio River Valley. You stay out of that land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. That's ours. Well, after the Treaty of Paris, that land now becomes part of America. So just like that, America's land doubles, or probably more than doubles. All right, the new American border isn't the Appalachian Mountains anymore, it's the Mississippi River. And finally, in the South, Florida becomes the border. Florida is still part of Spain for a few more years, and so Florida eventually essentially becomes the border in the South. All right, the third term, this one doesn't seem as important to us today, but it was at the time. U.S. received certain fishing rights off of Canada, particularly Newfoundland. That's a province of Canada up in the northeast. So America was not receiving Canada. Canada was staying part of Britain, but Britain said, but okay, you can send your fishing boats up here and to fish off of our waters. Right. Each side would pay its own debts. Now I'll give you a preview. How America would end up paying its own debts is going to be a big problem and a big debate and argument when Washington's president in a few years. So keep that kind of in the back of your mind, that each side was going to pay its own debts. 5, Britain would return captured slaves. All right, so remember, when you say captured, a lot of times we're really talking about runaway slaves. Remember, a lot of slaves would run away during the war to join the British or to seek protection from Britain. And Britain agreed to return them. I think sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But it's important to understand, again, you have this duality. All right, these two things happening side by side. Go back to what we've learned the first probably week or two of the semester. On the same year, America established self-government through creating the House of Burgesses in 1619 in Virginia. That was the same year they brought the first slave to America. Okay, so this sort of contradiction, hypocritical, if you would, policies continue to exist. In the same treaty where America is given its independence by Britain, America is also demanding the return of slaves. All right, so you always have this sort of dual issue in America. Some people are gaining more freedom, some people are being kept in slavery. Finally, the American Congress would recommend, not require, but recommend that property captured from Loyalists be returned to Loyalists. So Congress would basically say, hey, states, if y'all took away property from Loyalists, why don't y'all be nice and give it back? As you can imagine, it was often not given back. Okay, so these are the terms. You must know these terms of the Treaty of Paris, particularly the first couple. You've got to know this is the treaty that gave American independence, and you've got to know this is the treaty that expanded America's border, not from the Appalachian Mountains, but out to the Mississippi River. All right, so the United States is one, it's independent. What now? It's gained its independence, but it doesn't have a national government a truly national government in place. So what does it have to do? That will be the lessons in our next unit, where we learn about the drafting of the Constitution.